In 1800, France was bankrupt. Its paper currency was worthless, its people were exhausted, its enemies were circling. And yet, just 4 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte raised the largest army in Europe and paid for it without a functioning central bank, without gold reserves, and without the trust of foreign lenders. How? He discovered a loophole, not in the laws of France, but in the logic of debt itself. It looked like a patriotic effort to rebuild the economy. In truth, it was financial sleight of hand, a recursive system where debt paid for debt and confidence was manufactured, not earned. France didn't just borrow money, it invented a way to make others believe it was safe to lend, again and again, while offering little more than illusion. Napoleon understood what most modern citizens still don't, that public finance is not a vault of gold, but a theater of credibility. When trust collapses, nothing works. But when it can be simulated, even temporarily, an empire can rise from ashes. He used this insight like a weapon, and today's governments do the same, only with larger numbers and quieter names. Then it was rent. Today, it's sovereign bonds. Then, a handwritten ledger. Now, a $1 trillion market. But the mechanism? Almost identical. The trick was not to repay the debt. The trick was to never let the world ask for its money back, and to keep them believing it was all under control. What does that mean for us? It means the foundation of modern economies is built on a model that was born in crisis, tested in war, and preserved through performance. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every budget speech, every deficit, every rate hike. It all fits the same rhythm Napoleon set in motion more than 2 centuries ago. A rhythm of promises backed not by gold, but by belief. The year is 1799. France is reeling from a decade of revolution, bloodshed, and economic collapse. The monarchy is gone, the republic is fractured. Trust in government and currency in the future is nearly extinct. Inflation has ravaged the population. By 1796, the French assignat, a paper currency backed by confiscated church lands, had lost 99% of its value. Markets no longer accepted it. Workers demanded payment in bread, not banknotes. The revolution's promise of equality brought political upheaval, but not financial stability. France was broke. And not just temporarily, structurally. Tax collection had collapsed. Gold reserves were minimal. Foreign credit was frozen. The state had defaulted more than once. European monarchies, sensing an opportunity, formed coalitions to invade and restore the old order. Into this chaos stepped a 30-year-old general with no formal political experience, Napoleon Bonaparte. His coup on the 18th of Brumaire wasn't just a power grab, it was a rescue mission, not of liberty, but of solvency. He knew France didn't just need order, it needed liquidity, because an army, no matter how patriotic, cannot march without boots, food, and pay. Napoleon wanted expansion, but he first needed restoration. And here lies the paradox. To fund a future, he had to reanimate a collapsed financial system. But how do you convince lenders, investors, and merchants to believe in a government that just burned its last currency? The answer was not to replace the old system with a new one, but to reframe the illusion. In 1800, Napoleon established the Banque de France. On paper, it was a private institution. In practice, it served as the government's financial engine. But it wasn't just the bank's creation that changed the game. It was how he used it. Instead of promising repayment in gold, he offered predictability. Instead of raising taxes immediately, he refinanced past debts as future obligations. The key instrument? Government bonds, or rente as they were known. These were not new. The Ancien regime had used them for centuries. But under Napoleon, they gained a new function, not as stable investments, but as instruments of illusion. The trick was elegant. He offered high interest to attract buyers. Then he used the proceeds to pay existing expenses, including the interest on older bonds. This is not yet a Ponzi scheme, but it's close. The credibility of the entire mechanism rested not on France's economic fundamentals, but on the perceived control of the man at the top. Napoleon understood this. That's why his financial reforms coincided with symbols of stability, a new civil code, restored religious rights, and visible military victories. Each created the illusion of normalcy, and the illusion sustained the markets. The Banque de France did not hold enough reserves to cover its obligations, but as long as people believed it did, that belief became reality. Money, after all, is a shared fiction, and Napoleon was a master storyteller. But this was not just political theater. It was a strategic re-engineering of financial logic. France did not recover by paying its debts. It recovered by selling the idea that it could. And remarkably, it worked. Within a few years, bond prices stabilized. Tax revenues recovered. Investors returned. The French franc, introduced in 1803, became one of the most stable currencies in Europe for over a century. But under the surface, a dangerous precedent had been set. Trust, once manufactured, could be manipulated. Debt, once justified, could be multiplied. And the line between solvency and spectacle began to blur. By 1805, France appeared reborn. The streets of Paris were calmer. The army was victorious. The franc was stable. On the surface, it seemed Napoleon had performed an economic miracle. But underneath, the machine was overheating. The engine of the recovery, state borrowing, was consuming itself. To sustain his wars and reforms, Napoleon relied not on taxes, which took time and provoked unrest, but on a steady stream of credit. And that credit was tied to the rentes, perpetual bonds issued by the state, paying 5% interest for life. At first, investors were eager. They remembered the chaos of the revolution. Now they saw order, a strong leader, and guaranteed returns. The illusion held. But here's the flaw. The interest payments were fixed, permanent, and rapidly growing. Each new tranche of bonds paid for the last campaign, the last salary, the last deficit. But none of it addressed the core imbalance. The state was spending more than it earned, consistently, predictably. And now imagine, you're a banker in 1806. You hold government bonds. You see new ones being issued every quarter. You ask yourself, will this ever stop? Some did ask. Foreign creditors, especially in Amsterdam and Geneva, began demanding better terms. Others sold off bonds at a discount. The Banque de France had to intervene quietly to buy them back and maintain the illusion of demand. Behind closed doors, officials saw the warning signs. The interest burden had grown to absorb nearly 1/3 of government revenues. That's not theory, that's the math. For every 100 francs collected in tax, more than 30 went to paying interest. Not military supplies, not infrastructure, not salaries, just interest. This was no longer a financial plan. It was a financial trap. But Napoleon did not slow down. In 1806, he launched the Continental System, a trade blockade against Britain. It was economic warfare, intended to crush the British economy by denying it access to European markets. Instead, it choked France. Smuggling surged. Ports dried up. Customs revenues, once a key source of state income, fell sharply. But the bond payments continued. They had to. Missing even one would collapse the entire facade. So what did the state do? It borrowed more. It leaned harder into the very mechanism that created the pressure. Debt was no longer a tool, it was a dependency. Napoleon's wars, financed by rentes, became self-perpetuating. Victories were needed not just for glory, but to justify the illusion of solvency. Each campaign was also a message to investors. Trust us, we're still in control. But trust based on conquest is fragile. By 1812, with the disastrous invasion of Russia, the structure began to crack. Losses mounted, revenues shrank, borrowing costs rose, and the interest burden became a noose. Yet the Banque de France still issued new bonds. Why? Because it had no choice. The illusion had to continue, or collapse entirely. This was the turning point. Napoleon's financial model, once hailed as pragmatic genius, now revealed its true form, a system that required constant motion to avoid implosion. Debt was no longer a temporary solution, it was the permanent foundation. And modern governments, they built on the same blueprint, just with better branding. If this revealed how fragility hides in strength, share where you're watching from. Debt in Napoleon's hands was not just a liability. It was a controlled fiction, a story told through numbers. But every story needs structure, and this one had a precise mechanical logic. The backbone of the system was the rente perpetuelle, a perpetual annuity. In simple terms, the state borrowed money and in return promised to pay the lender 5% interest annually, forever. No maturity, no repayment of principal, just endless interest. It sounds stable, even responsible. After all, it avoids the chaos of sudden repayments. But here's the catch. With every new war, every administrative reform, Napoleon issued more rentes and never retired the old ones. The state's obligations grew like a shadow, always behind, never shrinking. Now imagine this. You loan 10,000 francs to the government. You receive 500 francs every year in return. But that same government is issuing thousands of other bonds just like yours, each with the same promise. Where do the payments come from? Not from profits, not from trade surpluses, but from taxes and more borrowing. And here we find the mechanism's core, rollover. The French state routinely issued new debt to cover old obligations, not because it was insolvent in the narrow sense, but because it was committed to sustaining the image of strength. The Banque de France played a key role. Although officially independent, it functioned as an arm of state policy. When bond demand fell, it quietly intervened, buying rentes on the open market, stabilizing prices, absorbing excess supply. This wasn't market confidence, it was simulated liquidity. It worked until it didn't, because the entire structure relied on one critical assumption, that buyers would continue to believe the state could always pay. If interest rates rose too high, the illusion would break. If tax revenues declined, repayments would strain the budget. If military defeats eroded faith in leadership, confidence would vanish overnight. Napoleon knew this. That's why he fought not just with cannons, but with appearances, parades, proclamations, medals, statistics, all designed to maintain trust, not just from the people, but from the markets. Because in this system, debt wasn't money owed. It was money created through belief, a self-reinforcing cycle. As long as bondholders believed France was stable, they kept lending. As long as they kept lending, France appeared stable. This loop, belief, credit, spending, belief, was the real engine of the Napoleonic economy. And now, look around. Modern nations do not issue rentes. They issue treasury bonds, gilts, sovereign notes. But the logic is eerily familiar. Debt is still rolled over. Central banks still intervene. Interest payments still consume vast slices of national budgets. The language has changed. The mechanism has not. And here's the paradox. What began as a desperate tool of wartime France became the default setting of modern public finance. The question is no longer how much do we owe? The real question is how long can belief last? By 1813, the numbers stopped lying. France's budget was collapsing. War losses in Spain and Russia drained manpower, territory, and income. Customs revenues, already battered by the continental system, fell by nearly half. Internal taxes stagnated. Foreign trade evaporated. But bond interest still had to be paid. Each month, millions of francs were funneled from a shrinking treasury to satisfy past promises. Not to win battles, not to rebuild roads, just to maintain the illusion of solvency. The Banque de France, once the engine of recovery, became a containment unit. It purchased unsold bonds, absorbed toxic paper, and tried to suppress panic in a market that had already begun to fracture. Confidence was leaking faster than money. By this point, the debt burden was unsustainable. In absolute terms, France's public debt had doubled in a decade. But that figure hides the real story. the state's capacity to service that debt through taxes and trade had shrunk. The interest payments consumed up to 40% of government revenue. In today's terms, that's like nearly half of your national budget going just to stand still. No growth, no reform, just inertia. The debt wasn't a bridge, it had become a wall, and the wall began to crack. In 1814, with Paris occupied and Napoleon forced to abdicate, the new Bourbon regime inherited a state still technically functioning, but financially frozen. Creditors were cautious, the bond market was jittery, investors demanded guarantees. The Banque de France operated under political uncertainty, barely holding its position. And the people? They had paid in silence. Food prices had soared, wages fell. Regional economies collapsed under the twin weights of taxation and war requisitions. Those who held bonds were protected. Those who lived paycheck to paycheck were not. It was, quietly, a transfer of burden from capital to citizen. No revolution, no riot, just quiet economic attrition. This is the cost structure of belief-based finance. When it works, it creates decades of artificial growth. When it fails, it leaves a crater, not just in budgets, but in trust. France recovered slowly, but the model Napoleon perfected, the continuous issuance of state debt as a substitute for real solvency, survived him. Governments saw the trick and copied it, because even in failure, the logic remained seductive. Borrow today, stabilize tomorrow, pay eventually. If this helped connect loss to logic, let me know where you're watching from. Then it was called a rente. Today, it's called a treasury bond. Then the Banque de France quietly propped up collapsing bond markets. Now, central banks call it quantitative easing. The terminology evolved. The logic remained intact. Modern finance operates on the same foundation Napoleon tested under fire. The state borrows against future income. Markets assess its credibility, and money flows, not because there is money, but because there is belief. But belief must be managed. Let's shift to 2008. The global financial crisis triggered panic. Banks froze, markets collapsed. Governments stepped in, not with cash they had, but with promises backed by borrowing. Massive stimulus packages, bailouts, bond issuance at historic scale. In the US, federal debt jumped from $9 trillion to over $16 trillion in just 5 years. In Europe, deficits soared as states raced to stabilize their economies. But the real pivot was psychological, not fiscal. Central banks bought the very debt governments issued. Just as the Banque de France had once done under Napoleon, discreetly, steadily, without calling it manipulation. Today, it's institutionalized, legal, expected. The US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, all maintain vast portfolios of government debt, not to profit, but to preserve the illusion of demand. And what about interest? Governments now pay record low yields on trillions in debt. In real terms, many are borrowing for free, or even getting paid to borrow. How is that possible? Because trust, or the simulation of it, is stronger than mathematics. Because markets believe states will never default. Because liquidity has replaced solvency as the core requirement. The result? A debt economy with no endpoint. In 2023, global public debt crossed $92 trillion. That's more than global GDP. And yet, panic is rare. Why? Because as long as interest is paid, as long as markets function, as long as belief holds, the game continues. But there are cracks. Interest rates are rising. Inflation is back. Servicing costs are growing. In the US, annual interest payments on federal debt have surpassed defense spending for the first time in history. In the Eurozone, several nations now allocate 10 to 15% of their budgets to debt service alone. Not to schools, not to health, just to interest. It echoes Napoleon's final years. Different century, same equation. So what's the lesson? Debt is not inherently dangerous. but belief is not infinite. Once trust breaks, as it did in 1812, as it nearly did in 2008, repair is not measured in policy, it's measured in generations. And the illusion, once exposed, cannot be rebuilt in the same way. History didn't change, only the labels did. Napoleon didn't invent debt, but he reprogrammed it. What was once a burden became a lever. What was once repayment became performance. And what was once gold-backed became belief-driven. 2 centuries later, the world runs on this same logic. Governments spend first, explain later. Markets chase signals, not substance. Central banks shape reality, not reflect it. And the deeper irony? The more debt becomes normal, the less visible its danger becomes, until it isn't. Napoleon's empire fell, not in a battle of ideas, but in a failure of margins. When confidence cracked, the system followed. Today's financial empires are broader, faster, digital, but no less fragile. Because belief, no matter how engineered, has a cost when it runs too long on borrowed time. This story didn't end, it simply changed costume.